To come to a different city, to come to a different place, to travel, to meet different people, to have a tour of the city. It's been fantastic coming here. So pleased that academic life is getting back to normal, and to just being able to enjoy the sessions yesterday afternoon and this morning. So thank you very much again, Maria. Thank you to all the organising committee for inviting me here. I'm going to be talking about some research which I've been doing, which started about 2018. So this is the research program I've been doing over the last 4 years or so. As Maria said, I've been looking at different sorts of labour market disadvantage, all the bad things about labour markets, unemployment and job insecurity and stress and so on, for most of my career. But in the last 4 years, I started looking at some of the more positive things about labour markets, about good quality jobs. And in particular, I was interested in some of those things. What happened if there was less work around for humans to do in the future? Obviously, I'm not going to be able to go into the details of lots of these research, the analyses I've been doing, but pretty much everything that I'm going to be talking about today is published in 3 different journal articles. There was one pre-pandemic, which I will talk about, which was in the Journal of Social Science and Medicine. And then this year, I published one paper in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, I'll show you, and there's one that isn't yet published, we've just had the proofs for a Journal of Social Policy, but if anybody wants the proofs of that, now it's been accepted, I'm happy to send those details out to anybody. So what I'm going to be talking about is the benefits, the good things about employment. Not so much economically. We know that people have a job, they're in paid employment to earn a wage. I'm interested in the other things, the social and psychological benefits of work, why it's so important. And in particular, the question that we started to ask myself and my research team 4 or 5 years ago was how much work, what was the optimal amount of work that you needed? And the reason that I've started to think about that and then turned it into a larger project was because it was that time that we were starting to get those predictions, very stark predictions, maybe ones that we don't take as seriously now as we did then, that in just a few years' time, we're not talking about the distant future, but we're talking about, when the young people in this room today are in mid-career, that perhaps half of the jobs that are done by human beings will be done by machines or computers. We see, demonstrations of very intelligent robots, but really it's the artificial intelligence, the big data that we think maybe the big changes are happening about. So what would that world look like in the future if there just wasn't the same demand? We weren't a society that was so centered around work. And clearly there have been lots of dystopian projections around that. But I think I could see as well that if we had the right policies, it could be a very positive future. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And then, of course, the pandemic came along, and that gave us another completely unexpected look at what happened when we just weren't able to work in the way we'd been used to. Let's hope there's plenty of room for questions. Let me go through. Let me talk about mental health. Again, this is something that I notice people are talking about a lot more. I know even when I talk with young people now, they're very familiar with the phrase about their own mental health, and they talk about it openly in a way that just wasn't the case with people talking about their own mental health 20 or 30 years ago. But just to be clear, because still there are some conceptions and misconceptions, we're not talking about here, in my work, about a relatively small number of people who've got really severe mental health problems, people who are clinically depressed or have got schizophrenia. What I'm interested in is the way that mental health affects all of us, and we're somewhere presumably on a continuum between the one very positive end, what people often call as people flourishing, people really enjoying life, being able to get the best out of life, being resilient, so even when things are going wrong, they're able to cope well with those. And then most of us are in the middle of, let's assume it's a bell-shaped distribution. And then, of course, there are the people who are in the other tail, where they're got symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety, and so on. There are different ways we measure this. Lots of, in the different surveys we have quite a variety. Sometimes people used to be asked, it was fashionable to ask how happy people were. That was seen as maybe a bit superficial. Now we're more likely to ask about their satisfaction with life, sometimes about their life as a whole, or satisfaction with their family life, their working life, their health, and so on. But most of the measures I'm going to be using today are multi-item measures that pick up, if you like, mild symptoms of anxiety and depression. And I'll show you an example of that so you can get an idea what we're measuring here. This is one of the measures that is used in one of the surveys. This is very commonly used in European Union, EU-wide surveys. So just you can think for yourself, where would you score on this? So you'd be asked to indicate for each of the following 5 statements, which is closest to how you have been feeling over the last 2 weeks. Have you felt cheerful and in good spirits? Did you feel calm and relaxed? Did you feel active and vigorous? Did you wake up feeling fresh and rested? And has your daily life been filled with things that interest you? And of course, these things will vary from week to week. That's a very positive measure, and it works very well. It translates incredibly well into all the different European languages. So that's why it's used so universally. Other measures I use tend to focus more on the negative things, about not being able to sleep well, about worrying excessively, feeling sad. Across all of the results I've got, pretty much, apart from 1 or 2 gender effects, it doesn't matter which of these measures you use. We're getting pretty much the same effects. And again, let me just show you, this is something that I think is very well understood. If we look at the effects of different life positions that people have on their well-being, you can see that, for instance, being married is fairly positive for you. This is data from Scotland. It's happened to be from about 20 years ago, you'll understand, from some economists, Bell and Blanchflower. And here the base category is female, employed and single. But if I'd taken the same sort of data, whether it's 50 years ago or 2 years ago, you get incredibly consistent patterns. If you could look at in Northern European countries or Southern European countries, countries with very generous welfare states or very mean welfare states, you get very similar results. So this is one of those things that, despite what we say about sociology being very particular to different human societies and socially constructed, this does seem to be a remarkably resilient finding. So again, in this particular measure, they use being male was slightly worse than females, but as I say, gender is the one thing that this is sensitive. Women maybe admit more to worrying about things than men do. Being divorced isn't good for you. Being separated is even worse for you because it's happened recently. You don't get over it. But of course, the big thing on this graph, the massive thing, is unemployment. Compared to most other life events that happen to people, unemployment has a much more negative effect on your well-being. And it doesn't wear off. As long as you stay unemployed, it's not like being divorced. You get over it. You find new relationships. The effect wears off. As long as you stay unemployed, pretty much the effect doesn't get worse after the first few months, but it's not going to get back to the baseline. Of course, I'm dealing here with aggregate figures for whole societies. When you look at individuals, it's very different. There are people who have such terrible jobs that giving up a job and becoming unemployed is very positive. There are people, but they're a very small number, who can use unemployment in a very positive way. But when we look at the aggregate figures, this is what we get. And again, you're thinking, what about causality? We've got some very good data to look at how these things wear off over time. We've got longitudinal data. And sure enough, there are people who are unemployed because they have poor mental health. But overwhelmingly, the effect is straightforwardly a causal one, that there is something about being in employment that is protective of people's mental health in a big way. There's a bit more controversy among social psychologists about what it is, and the main theory we have still goes back to the work of Marie Jahoda, a social scientist who was working all through the 20th century, and she was doing her initial research in Austria back in the 1920s, but continued to work in the UK and the US after that. And her theory, it's not the only theory, but it's the most dominant theory. I'll come back to some other critiques of it later in a small way, but it's not the main focus of my talk. She says that the manifest, the obvious reason for working, if you ask people why do you work, it's to get paid. But actually, it's the accidental and latent reasons for working that give you the benefits, the psychological benefits of work. And this isn't because human resource managers are so generous that they're deliberately creating jobs that are good for us. It's purely an accident of history that when we created jobs in the way that they are created and have been relatively unchanged for the last 200 years, we just happen to have created something that works well for people's psychological well-being in industrial societies. Clearly, before people had jobs in pre-industrial societies, I'm not saying they were all depressed and anxious all the time, but she also points out it's very difficult to find other mass institutions which protect people's well-being. Lots of people have tried to find other ways of boosting the well-being of the unemployed, and almost always they fail. What are the things that she says? And she gives a list of 5 things. Again, other sociologists and psychologists have come up with other lists that are more inclusive than this, that sometimes distinguish between good and bad jobs. But Yehuda's initial list, she said, there are 5 things you get from the average job, from most jobs, not just good jobs, but most jobs. You get a time structure. You know which parts of the week you can spend with your family and which time you should be, sleeping and working and so on. You get enforced activity. You're not ruminating. You're not sitting around with nothing to do, worrying about things all the time. You get social contact, not just social contact with the people inside your family, because those contacts tend to be very emotionally charged. Parents are always arguing with each other, they're arguing with their children, arguing with their parents. But when you go to work, usually, for most of us, we have less emotional relationships at work, and they're, she says, are very beneficial to us. You have a collective purpose, and probably from my research later, you'll see this is maybe the most important thing. You're not just there to look after yourself in this world, but you're there to do things with other people for things that you think are important. And they could be highly altruistic, they could be looking after sick children, they could be just selling more stuff. It doesn't seem to matter. As long as you've got that collective purpose, that's important. And finally, Marie Yehuda says, in our society, we get so much status from being employed. That's our main identity. One of the things that people hate about being unemployed is when people ask them what they do, because it's such a negative way of describing yourself. So that's Yehuda's list. Like I say, I'm not saying that's the definitive list, but that's the clear idea that Yehuda has and works well. It's been tested endlessly. There's good evidence behind it. What nobody seems to, it's one of those questions you sometimes come up with in your research, and it's such an obvious question that you think somebody must have asked this question before, and there must be a whole, you Google it, and you think you'll find hundreds of people who've got answers to this question. How much work do you need to get the benefits? Because everything else in this world, if it's proper medicine, if it's scientifically based, you know how much to take of it, what the dose is. If you've got a headache, if you were drinking too much last night, you take some of these tablets. And it says on the back of the tablets that if you're an adult or a child over 12, you take 2 of these. If you only take half of one, you'll still have headache. If you take the whole packet, you'll be sick in other ways. Again, doctors tell us we have to eat fruit and vegetables, but they tell us it's not good enough just to eat 1 cherry every day. You need 5 decent portions of fruit and vegetables. And so on with sleep, how much sleep we need that's good for us, not too much, not too little, how much salt, how many calories we need to have, how many steps we should take. My watch tells me how many steps I have to take each day to stay healthy, how much vitamin C I need, how much alcohol or how little alcohol, and so on. With everything else out there, I could find what there was good scientific evidence on the optimal dose. I couldn't find any evidence at all about optimal dosage of paid work. There is a literature, sure enough, on what happens when you work too much, when you work very long hours. And there's all sorts of evidence there. You're more likely to get musculoskeletal problems. You won't be such a good parent. You're more likely to burn out and so on. That's robust evidence. And that's why we had the European Working Time Directive, which I thought was a fantastic piece of legislation. It really did reduce the number of people in Europe who were working very long hours, and so we got all the benefits, not only for them individually, but for society. But what about, we know, okay, what the maximum is. And there's good evidence that once you work more than, say, 45 hours a week, everything starts to, get worse. But what's the optimal dose? Again, one thing I would strongly recommend people to do before you do your research, go out and ask your colleagues, ask the wise people you know what they think the answer to this is. And I did that, and I got lots of different answers. Lots of people saying, well, they were sure probably working 4 days a week was just fine, but they weren't convinced that working less than that, you'd still get the benefits. Other people, other colleagues said maybe even going down to 2 days of work a week would be okay. That's where you get the peak well-being. What we found was something actually different from what I predicted or different from anyone else predicted. Certainly, it's not the 40-hour week. Of course, lots of the answers I had were all about, and I don't know if you find this, but when you ask people about why we work in the way they do, people almost assume that if you look in the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, this tells us that we should work a 40-hour week, that there's something ingrained in that pattern of working and sleeping and time to do what you want. And of course, there isn't. Of course, this is a very new innovation in how we run human societies. But still, again, I was interested in how many people thought this was entirely the normal, the natural way of running your life, and clearly it isn't. But if we are going to see that time when robots take over, are able to do a lot of the work, and if, unlike previous technological revolutions, we're able to turn that into a genuine reduction in working time, what should we be aiming for? And of course, this is where we get all those dystopian visions of mass unemployment, because if computers and robots can do all the work that humans were doing, we see those pictures of unemployment that was been unimaginable for anything we've seen in the 20th or 21st century. I'm thinking that, and even with, again, economists talk a lot about having a universal basic income, other ways of distributing money around people, if we can no longer use the labour market as the main way in which we distribute wealth among a population. But as you can see from where I'm coming from, even if you manage to achieve that, even if we don't have horrendous inequalities in wealth because of mass unemployment, we still are going to suffer all the psychological problems you'd have with mass unemployment. Of course, we could invent new jobs as we've done in the past, and this could be irrelevant. But I think if we start to think about a future where people are working less than we are at the moment, maybe much shorter weeks than we are in the future, I think that provides us a really optimistic vision of society. So I got quite excited. I found this work a lot less depressing than most of the work I do in labour markets, looking at various forms of human misery. So we did some analysis. I've done lots of qualitative analysis, and that's much more interesting than this, but you're economists, and I know you like looking at numbers, so I'm going to show you the quantitative analysis. But we also interviewed a lot of people who are already working unusual hours, short hours, and we've got other ongoing qualitative studies at the moment. So, but we did look, just to say if you want to, and again we've written them up and they've been published, looked at people who just had things that were so important in their lives, whether it was making music or climbing mountains or whatever, they were already spending a lot less time in work. And they were usually happy people. Not always. There are problems when everybody else is working 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week, and you're working a much shorter time. You put yourself outside of normal society. But if I go on to start using the UK household panel study, I think many of you will be already familiar with this. And we looked at, over an 8-year period, using fixed effects models, so we had about 70,000 observations, and the results were very quickly found them into all the newspapers, and they were saying that we were telling people they should work just 1 day a week. That's the optimal amount of work. I love being in the newspapers, but of course, in this case, they got it completely wrong, and none of us ever said everybody should just work 1 day a week to benefit your mental health. This is what we actually found. And so we had fixed effects models, like I say, looking at people as they went in and out of unemployment and looking at people as they went in and out of inactivity. And that would be mainly for people of working age, that would be mainly more women than men, obviously, mainly doing with caring activities for young children. And we had several different measures. We used the GHQ-12 that someone mentioned in one of the sessions this morning. We had life satisfaction measures, and they all gave similar sorts of results. This is a measure of mental functioning, yet another measure of psychological well-being. And overall, although in some cases we get fairly small sample sizes because there's not that many men working shorter hours. Let me just talk you through this graph. So here on the bottom this is a number of hours that people were working in each of those 8 years that we asked them, going from not working at all because they were unemployed or not working at all because they were inactive. And then we had all the categories in 8-hour groups up to, or sometimes 4, sometimes 8 hours, up to 48 hours a week. And you can see we've got separate lines, separate graphs here for men and women. Again, using this particular measure, again, it's confusing. The higher numbers show better mental health. And you can see on this measure, men were doing better than women, but don't read anything into that. I think that's an artifact of this particular measure. But you can see in both graphs, there's actually very little evidence of any difference in people's well-being, whether they're working up to 8 hours a week, 1 day a week basically, or working a normal working week or a bit more. The lines are flat. And again, we found this again and again. It's not what we expected. But in each case, very clearly, once you go to work not working at all, your mental health is much lower. But you only need a small amount of work each week to give you all the benefits of paid employment psychologically. So once you're working for more than 1 day a week, it might benefit your pay packet, but it's not benefiting your psychological health at all. A surprising finding. But again, not unlike, there are lots of other things that we know, like vitamin C, where a microdose, a very small dose, is all that you need for your well-being. And whether you have a few milligrams of vitamin C a day or the equivalent of 1,000 oranges of vitamin C a day, you don't get any more benefit. But if you have no vitamin C a day, then you get seriously ill and eventually die. So that was our first finding, which was, I think, a very positive finding. So if we do move towards a reduced working time, okay, we're not seeing any clear benefits in people's well-being, but neither are we seeing any problems with their well-being, right down to 1 day a week. And I think, again, the policy implications for this in the pandemic were very clear, and I'll come back to looking at that. But in other words, as far as possible in economic crises like the pandemic, keeping everybody in paid employment, even if it's only for 8 hours a week, is far superior, preferential for their mental health, than having some people losing their jobs completely and becoming economically inactive or becoming unemployed. That was just UK data. We were able to do the same thing with the European Working Conditions Survey. It's not longitudinal data, it's repeated cross-sectional data, so we can't get the same confidence about causality in it, but it's nice to look at different countries to see whether the UK was a unique case in this way. It also allows us, the UK longitudinal survey has only got 1 or 2 questions about employment. We can't get good measures of employment quality. When we go to the European Working Conditions, we can. And this is from the paper we published earlier this year in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. And let me explain it to you. So what we've got here is 8 different measures of job quality. And this is the model which is most widely used in the EU now when looking at, that whole Lisbon project of more and better jobs in the EU. Now we're very clear. When that was said back in the Lisbon summit, nobody really knew what we meant by better jobs, or we had a very limited view of it being higher wage jobs. Now, certainly the Eurofound, they've got this model that they use, and I think it works well. So, okay, earnings, having higher earnings and fair earnings as well is important, but also being able to use your skills and more importantly, discretion at work, being in a good physical environment, not being in a loud, smoky or dangerous environment where you're having to be in uncomfortable positions. The social environment, being respected at work, not being bullied at work. Work intensity, being free from continual pressure, time pressure or other emotional pressures at work. Having good prospects or job security so that you're not worried about losing your job and you've got things to look forward to, possibly learning and getting promotions at work. Working time quality, again, not just protection from long hours, but not being on a 0-hour contract, not having hours that vary from week to week, not having to work nights or unsociable hours, long shifts and so on. And finally, meaningful work, thinking that you're doing something useful, that you're contributing to society in a useful way. And on each of these graphs, again, on the horizontal axis, you can see we've chunked people's working hours from 1 to 16 hours. We would having small number problems for men working short hours, up to the longer hours of 41 to 48 hours. And you can see pretty much in all of the cases, the line is fairly flat. Again, same result as we got before. The European Working Conditions Survey, as the name suggests, only picks up people in employment. So we can't make a comparison with the unemployed or the economically inactive here. But for those people within work, using that exact same measure of mental health that I shared with you earlier, in each case, the amount of work that people are doing in hours seems relatively unimportant, as long as you're working a minimum of 1 day or 2 days a week. What's clearly much more important is here when we split the low quality jobs, the people below the median on these measures, and the high quality jobs, now you see big effects. It clearly makes a big difference if you're doing a job that you think is meaningful, if you're in a social environment where you're not being bullied, where you're being respected, listened to. Having good prospects is clearly important. Not having time pressures on you is really important. And I think that's something to remember when we maybe come back to that later. So having a good job is really important. The quality of your job is supremely important. How many hours you work is really quite unimportant. We even looked at people who were involuntarily working short hours because they couldn't get a full-time job. And those tend to be poor quality jobs. Those are the most desperate people in the labour market who are being forced to take short hours, poor quality jobs. But if you control for the quality of those jobs, they're still better off working in those jobs than being out of the labour market. So again, it's the same lesson, the same unexpected lesson, that everybody, clearly the policy implications are, everybody should be working, everybody should have a good quality job, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. And then after that, we did those analyses, then the pandemic hits, then of course we're all really worried about what's going on in the labour market. Crazy stuff is happening, things that we've never seen before, certainly not in living memory of anybody, and how we cope with this. And different countries, we saw clearly very different reactions in the United States, in Germany, in the UK, and across Europe. And we were able to publish very quickly. We got really some quite much poorer quality data in those very early months of the pandemic. Again, something that I haven't got to show you today, unfortunately, is what happened to people as they continued through the pandemic. I don't have that sense, and some of these early effects might have been more to do with the shock of what happened back in March and April in 2020. But nevertheless, I think in some ways, we had a clear theoretical understanding of what we were going to expect to happen, and we're expecting people who reduced their hours to maintain their well-being, yet people who lost their work completely to be the ones who suffered. Those were the first analyses we did, just the cross-sectional data, and I'm going to skip over those because it took us a lot longer to then, because we had this longitudinal data, we could take everybody who was in paid employment pre-pandemic. Again, it's quite a complex survey, the Understanding Society, this UK panel survey. They don't try and measure everybody at the same time. It's a rolling panel. So they're interviewing even before they finish the last wave, they're starting the new wave. So it can be used as a more smooth time series as well as a set of fixed waves. And some of them, they hadn't finished the pre-pandemic, the normal wave by the beginning of the pandemic. But we could go back to those people who had the vast majority of the data set, who were then, and they were interviewed, clearly they couldn't do the face-to-face, door-to-door interviewing anymore. It was done primarily by telephone. It was a smaller sample. Some of the questions they got badly wrong. They didn't have the whole year to test and pilot the survey. But here we are, here's the data for men, and a lot of it is exactly as we predicted. You could see those people who became unemployed, and here we didn't have the ILO definition of unemployment. This is people who, more correctly, lost their job, whether they then defined themselves as unemployed or as a full-time carer, stay-at-home mother or father, we don't know. They were the ones who we saw this really quite dramatic fall in their GHQ-12 scores, their mental health scores. For the others, whether they remained in part-time work or remained in full-time work, their mental health was relatively unaffected. The group we were really interested in was the people who were working full-time but then went to part-time. Again, no noticeable effect there in terms of so this group here, just as good that group there, just as good as anyone else for the men. So losing hours of work doesn't seem detrimental to your psychological well-being at all. I suppose the bit that we were most surprised about was the people who were furloughed. And in the UK, the furlough model was that you had to completely give up work. That was a government regulation. In order for you to have your wages subsidised by the government, you had to completely give up work. We now know that a lot of people didn't. They took the subsidy and continued to work maybe a few hours doing maintenance tasks. Many people then found they could work at home when they're on furlough. I think some people got bored, or all sorts of reasons why people were illegally working. So some of them weren't without work. They were working often shorter hours. But we also, again, going back to critiques of Yehuda's model, and probably the most important critique was by Fryer, David Fryer, another social scientist, psychologist. And he looked at particular people unemployed, but unemployed for a very fixed period where they were guaranteed re-employment. People who are unemployed indefinitely, you don't know when you're going to find work again. You don't know how to make your savings last if you have any savings. You don't know, all those important life decisions are on hold about buying houses, having children and so on. Being indefinitely unemployed is a really paralyzing situation for an individual. But if you're unemployed for 3 months and guaranteed a job at the end of it, it can be like being on a long holiday. It can be like a student having a nice long summer. You can plan to do things, you can decorate your house, you can improve your garden, you can improve your golf handicap. People use that time quite usefully. And we got lots of examples in the UK of people really doing things they'd always wanted to do but never had the time to do. Learning to play a musical instrument, learning a new language, and so on. So we don't quite know what's going on with the furlough. That could have worn off. It could be a honeymoon effect. We don't know. This was very early. But there you are. That was, for men, it seemed our evidence, that very useful experiment that came along, bore out what we thought about reduced time work. For women, we got a very different pattern. And again, listening to some of the papers this morning, we realised how the pandemic was so different, the experience for women was so different to men, particularly with schools closing and people having to homeschool their children. And it was, played chaos. And of course, you can see that although I'm a bit suspicious of putting too much into the actual mental health decline, because we were measuring it a different way. And we know that measuring face-to-face mental health and measuring them by telephone, you can get different sorts of effects. But you can see there's clear evidence that for women across all categories, they suffered a really quite a noticeable drop in their mental health going when we compare their pre-pandemic scores with the pandemic. And here we see, interestingly, no difference among, certainly no statistically significant difference among the different categories of women, whether they lost their job completely, got furloughed, or had a change in working hours. If anything, the women who did best, the ones who went from full-time to part-time, but the differences were very marginal and not statistically significant. And that's like I say, that's the paper which has been accepted for publication, but isn't yet in print, but I'm happy to share the proofs. So let me move to some conclusions. There are lots of different people writing, often social theorists, often people with no interest in data whatsoever, but only interested in theorizing, talking about a post-work world, looking at that as a utopian thing, and again, continuing, of course, there's that great tradition in economics, those economists like Marx and like Keynes, who were, I would argue, right about most things, and along with some of the philosophers at the time, were arguing that certainly by now, or even long before now, their grandchildren would be working much shorter hours, be working maybe 2 days a week, according to Bertrand Russell, 15 hours a week, according to Keynes. And of course, we haven't seen it yet, maybe we're about to. But there are people who are welcoming that, and I would call them, if you like, the anti-work. See that all work as basically as one form or another of exploitation, better or worse, but always exploitation. So the idea of liberating people from certainly compulsory work, and so people can work if they want to, but they have other ways of sustaining themselves. That's a school of thought which is interesting. I don't see any evidence at all that would create a better society. In fact, to me, that would seem to be a society that would be quite dysfunctional. But I am interested in an idea of a world where paid work isn't such a big part of our working lives, where it isn't the thing that dominates our lives over, most of us spend more time with our work colleagues than we do with our family or our friends or doing our leisure activities and so on. So I do see a move in that direction as being something that I could find something we have evidence for and something that would work well. There are other ways of looking at it too, and certainly a lot of people interested in climate change and the fact that very clearly, even as we look at the news this week of what's going on in the United States, anybody optimistic that we're going to meet our climate goals, I think, is not looking at the data. And certainly that idea that the only way that we will meet our climate goals is by degrowth, which would mean negative economic growth through people working much shorter hours. I still think politically it's suicidal for any political party that actually you're not going to get elected by telling people that if you get elected, you'll make them all poorer. But yeah, I think something we have to start taking more seriously for climate change reasons. I'm much more positive, though, about gender equality. If we look at the figures on gender inequality over, say, the last 40, 45 years, since we've had equal pay legislation in many European countries, and that legislation has obviously been modified, it's become had more teeth over the years, and we can see, I think pretty much in all EU member states, a radical reduction in the gender pay gap, for instance. But it's become much more difficult now that all the low-hanging fruit has been taken to see how we're going to continue with that. We clearly still do have a gender pay gap. It's maybe nearer 10% than 40% in the countries like it was back in the 1970s. But if we're going to go forward, I think, to me, the most obvious way in which that might happen is to take more seriously the idea that everybody is equally involved in paid work and in childcare. And that is something which would be much more achievable if we were working much shorter hours. So instead of that idea of having the breadwinner model and the second person in a household working shorter hours, which is quite dominant certainly in many European countries, imagine what it would be like if in all European countries everybody was working a much shorter week that would allow them a much fuller life as a carer as well as their paid employment. To me, that seems to be a utopian future. I'll be interested to hear what people think about that. I suppose just a couple more slides. One of the puzzles that I still think about a lot is why Keynes was wrong, effectively. Why we've seen some reduction in working hours, and we have longer in retirement, we have longer in education now. But the reduction in working hours has been very moderate over the past 100 years. In most European countries, again, there are noticeable variations. But compared to the incredible advances we've had in productivity, over the longer run, we've had on average, if you look at most European countries, over the past 100 years, we've had about 1.5% or 2% increase in productivity each year, better human capital, better technology, better management. So now each one of us is doing the equivalent work of 4 or 5 people 100 years ago, which should have allowed us a really dramatic reduction in working hours that we haven't seen. Is it because of the housing market, the way we're all competing for housing in many overpopulated, highly populated areas of Europe? Is it because advertising, consumerism is so much more a bigger thing now than it was before? Advertising is so much more powerful than it was, so we really want to, even though each of us know, if you ask people out there, if you ask them, getting rich, does it make you happy? Most people say no, and yet we still watch the adverts and we still want the newer cars and the newer phones and all those things that our wealth has brought us. I think as well, increasing quality of jobs. I don't have any empirical evidence to back this up. I think jobs now are much better than the jobs that our grandparents did. And that, again, makes it easier for us to work longer hours. We're not having to go down into coal mines anymore, working in unpleasant and dangerous environments. But then, as well, in many countries, trade unions more recently have had very good ways in most countries of bargaining around pay and other working conditions, but certainly in the UK, haven't been focusing on working hours at all. It's just not part of collective bargaining. And then there are norms that everyone else is working long hours, we work long hours, and the work ethic. One of the things that I think I notice so much now, and I think much more powerful now than 50 or 100 years ago, is that idea that the best way to show that you're a valuable and important person is by showing that you work very long hours, that you work very intensively. Let me just tell you what I'm doing at the moment. This is the research that I've been doing over the last 6 months and will be continuing for the next 6 months, is these big 4-day week trials. I know Spain, again, has been taking very seriously the idea of moving towards 4-day weeks. In the UK, we've got, I think, the biggest trial that we've had globally yet. We've got 70 employers who promised at the beginning of June, some have got a slight delay on the start, but a few weeks ago now, that they were going to reduce their working hours by 20%, usually by everybody taking Friday off. So we shouldn't be here today. Today should be the weekend, by the way. In a few weeks' time, when we all realise the 4-day week is a good idea, we'll all be taking Fridays as part of the weekend, but not quite yet, obviously. But no, seriously, these firms are promising, but not only this reduction in working time, nobody's going to take a pay cut, 100% pay, 80% working hours, and 100% productivity. They're going to aim, anyway, to try and work smarter and get the same amount of work done. So if you invite me back next year, I'll tell you what the outcome of this trial was, whether we managed it. My big worry is that because this isn't coming from employers, this isn't coming from trade union pressure. Trade unions aren't part of this at all. This is coming from employers. And by trying to get people to do the same amount of work, not only does this not spread the work more widely, but in some cases, and with some evidence is already emerging, what it's doing is just making people work under more time pressure. And if you remember my slide from the European Working Conditions Survey, one of the most negative things about a job for your psychological well-being is having to work under continual time pressure. And if people have the choice of working 5 days in a more relaxed way or 4 days under time pressure, I think for many people the rational thing to do is to work in a more leisurely way. So I think maybe if we're going to take that reduction in working hours seriously, it has to go along with a realization that we also have to reduce individual productivity, in the short term anyway. There you are. Let me finish there. And I hope get some questions. Yeah.